for coming today. Please bear with my voice. This is the first day I've been out of pajamas in 5 days. So I'm Carol Senti, and I'm the state representative of District 59, and I'm extremely proud to introduce a new piece of legislation that we filed this morning. It will continue to move Illinois in the direction of becoming a leader in the safety of children's brains. It is called the Dave Duerson Act to prevent CTE. With me this morning are some key initial members of the Duerson Act Coalition, including Treg Duerson, former Chicago Bears safety Dave Duerson's son, Otis Wilson, one of Dave Duerson's 1985 Super Bowl teammates and Bears linebacker, Mike Adamle, former Chicago Bears running back and Chicago sportscaster, Liz Nicholson, the wife of a former U of Illinois and Cleveland Browns lineman Jerry Sullivan, and Chris Nowinski, PhD and CEO of the Concussion Legacy Foundation. Over my 8-year career, I have the history of advocating for youth safety and for empowerment with 7 prior bills, including Zach Tron's law to make sure typical soccer goals were firmly secured after the death of their 6-year-old son, and my 2014 law that required concussion certification for all high school coaches. I want to thank other legislators that worked on the concussion issue with me in the past. Former leader Tom Cross, Senator Kwame Raoul, former Senator Dan Gutowski, Representatives Christian Mitchell and Marcus Evans. We have all made sure that Illinois is a leader in concussion protocol, but as the science and the data move forward and progress, and so must we, and we now turn our attention to CTE, chronic, traumatic, encephalopathy. It's a neurodegenerative disease found in individuals with multiple head injuries and repetitive subconcussive hits to the head. Athletes who begin playing contact sports at younger ages are at greater risk for neurological impairment later in life. Several published studies show that exposure to tackle football before the age of 12 is associated with the greater risk of neurological impairment than exposure to tackle football starting at or after the age of 12. Children as young as 5 are playing tackle football. Playing football, they are taking hits in practice and at games with forces that are similar to what college players are taking, but their brains not fully coated with nerve cell protection that develops over time, with their weak head weight to neck strength ratio and their slower recovery rate, and their inability to provide meaningful, informed consent about the risk of their choice to play tackle football. Much less like the U.S. Soccer Association, the U.S. Soccer Federation implemented guidelines for no headers for children under the age of 11, and the U.S. Hockey Association implemented guidelines for no body checking under the age of 13. The Dave Duerson Act to prevent CTE prevents a child under the age of 12 from playing tackle football in any organized youth sports organization. A child under the age of 12 can participate in any other athletic activities, including but not limited to touch football or flag, just like the NFL's top 5 all-time players, Walter Payton, Tom Brady, Jerry Rice, Lawrence Taylor, and Jim Brown did. The evidence has been mounting, especially over the past 6 years since I've been tracking this issue and reading all the research I can get my hands on. This bill is a natural progression of the data and the science. We can protect our children's brains, and we can protect football. Our coalition would like to make our collective presentation first, and then we're all happy to stay and answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Carol Senti, and thank you to all the coalition members here today. I especially want to thank the former Chicago Bears, Mike Adamle, and my father's dear friend, Otis Wilson, as well as the Concussion Legacy Foundation and Chris Nowinski. This was the group that received my father's brain donation. This bill honors my family's hope and my father's legacy to protect future athletes and the future of football. When my father tragically took his own life, he donated his brain to science in hopes of being part of a solution. My family followed through with the donation so that we could find answers to many questions. Research on CTE has helped us better understand his past strange behavior, the times when he was ashamed by his forgetfulness and confusion, and the times when he was overwhelmed with anger and depression. We also sought answers that might lead to a safer game of football, from the professional level down to Pop Warner. We know all too well the stories of men like my father, men like Kevin Turner, Mike Webster, Junior Seau, and too many others. Their lives ended in a reversal of fortune and in an ironic state of vulnerability, a distant reality from the stardom and glory that these men once experienced. Through research on my father's brain and others, we now know with certainty that part of the solution is to guard young children's developing brains from the dangers of tackle football. We have an obligation to protect children's futures, especially when we know how brain trauma can be prevented. At a young age, football should be about learning the basic techniques of throwing and catching and running. It should be about learning teamwork and sportsmanship. Millions of children can still tie on their cleats and enjoy the game without inflicting harm on each other and risking their own futures. Most children will not attain the fortune and fame as a pro football player, but they should all have a chance at a healthy future. That starts by keeping them safe on the field and allowing them the opportunity to become their best selves in the classroom, on the playground, and beyond. It's an honor to have this bill in my father's name to protect children, as well as to help protect the future of football. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Treg, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Liz Nicholson Sullivan, and I am the wife of a profoundly sick and damaged former NFL football player, and I am not alone. My husband, Jerry Sullivan, has a life of football, not only under his belt, but also, unfortunately, in his brain. He started in Pop Warner at the very young age of 8, and followed by Oak Park River Forest High School and University of Illinois, and then 9 years in the NFL, 2 in the USFL. That is, unfortunately, 22 years of subconcussive and concussive hits. I agonize over this, as does my husband. And I cannot help but think that the accumulation of hits would have been reduced had he at least been precluded from playing in those early years of football. And perhaps the severity and the onset of this illness that I call the football disease, but we all sort of know as CTE, would have been delayed or perhaps not as severe as it is now. So let me explain this illness that we call CTE, which I call the football disease because we see it so prevalent in our community of former football players. So while my husband was diagnosed with dementia at the age of 52, dementia is just sort of the easier to swallow, easy to comprehend diagnosis that a lot of people are familiar with. But the illness really started years before the dementia diagnosis, as it does with most of these folks that are sick, most of these players. And let me explain a little bit about what these symptoms are that we see that are so common among our community. So years prior to dementia, my husband experienced unmitigated rage, confusion and paranoia, aggression, debilitating depression, severe sleep disturbances, and unfortunately suicidal ideation, which is very common among folks that have the football disease, which is then later usually CTE, unfortunately. So as I've lamented with other wives and family advocates, sick and often volcanic men are foisted on women and children to care for. And these men sometimes are so aggressive, and there's a lot of domestic violence and things that no one human being could even deal with this when you've got CTE. So it's a very difficult situation for the family members to be in, which is why I'm very much proud of this group that I'm a part of. The outcome of this is never good. In fact, it's mostly tragic. As you know, there's been a lot of, as Treg mentioned and as Carol mentioned, there's a lot of things that we know in the media that we see all the time of the Junior Seaus or the Mike Websters. But there's a whole community of us that are suffering from this, not only the men, but also the wives and the family members. So as we begin to grasp the science behind CTE, I ask that you review the facts and protect the most vulnerable among us, the children that are often tossed into this dangerous game of Russian roulette. I'm asking you to do the right thing and support the Dave Duerson Act to prevent CTE, because I'm telling you from experience, it's not worth the devastating risk. So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you.
You've all heard my story if you live in Chicago before about what's been going on in my life. But just let me say that when you ask a player, a former player, would you do it all over again? And I say that's really kind of unfair. It's kind of a trick question because a lot of what has happened to me in my life before all this thing came about was because of the fact that my football career was a launching pad for some of the things that I was able to do today, from way back when, from becoming a sportscaster at a variety of different places. I've been in the television business for about 30 years, and I think I would never have been in that position were it not for my prowess in football. All that being said, given what we know today, and if I had to do it all over again, I certainly would I have not done something that maybe that would have put me in harm's way. And what Liz Nicholson said about what happens to husbands and maybe someday all the women who play sports like soccer and whatever, nobody wants that, and I think it's not going away, these kind of sports. So that being said, let's make it safer. It was tough for me because I grew up in a football family. My dad was an all-pro linebacker for the Cleveland Browns in from 1950 through 56, and he was in the age when there were no face masks. He had a guy named Paul Brown, who was a legendary football coach, invented the helmet and the face mask, which was a big thing back then. My dad did not let me play, though. He did not let me play until the 9th grade, and because he knew that this was something that happened to young men, especially if you weren't prepared for it. I was the starting guard for Kent Roosevelt High School, and I weighed a whopping 125 pounds. I had a helmet that it would go like this. You spin it around. We call them brain buckets. But it was, Otis knows all about that. And that's the other thing, as I got, older and older. See, this is the kind of shit that happens all the time. What is it called, honey?
What's that?
The functioning with your hands.
Oh, your fine motor.
The fine motor skills,
Be careful there.
Those are gone. But I think Otis would say the same way. This is the other thing. Being this side, I had the guys like him tackling me. But it was fun. It was great. I had to prove the little guy has to prove he can play. The big guy has to prove he can't. So all that knowledge that we've, it makes it very, very hard. But I want to do everything that I can. It's going to eventually kill me. I don't know when, but I found out there's some things that you can do to abate the decline that happens in all of us. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And if it takes, having my brain found out in some place in Boston, I'm all for that. So anyway, let's just, I don't know, pray that something gets done.
I'm Dr. Chris Nowinski, CEO of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, also the co-founder of the Brain Bank, where Mr. Duerson's brain was studied in 2011. But I grew up here in Illinois. I played football at John Hersey High School in Arlington Heights, and then was lucky to go on to play at Harvard. When we started the Brain Bank in 2008, there were only 4 cases of CTE in football players recorded throughout history. Since then, we've identified CTE in over 200 former football players, including Mr. Duerson. And unfortunately, it's been in 85% of those men that we have studied. But the important thing is it's not just confined to NFL players. We know about Dave Duerson, we know about Mike Pyle. We don't always hear about the stories of college football players and high school football players who've also been diagnosed with CTE, many of them here in the state of Illinois. In our study in JAMA in 2017, we published that 48 of the first 53 college football players we studied had CTE, and 3 of the first 14 high school football players as young as 17 years old. This brain donation program has taught us a lot about CTE, and that's why we're able to back this bill today, because we've learned two simple things. One, risk of CTE appears best correlated to how many years of tackle football you play. It's called a dose-response relationship. It's very much like smoking and lung cancer. We all know that the more years you smoke, the greater your risk of lung cancer. So that's the first thing we learned. The second thing we've learned is that the young brain is more vulnerable to this damage. Study after study is showing that starting tackle football before 12 leads to greater neurological impairment later in life. And that's no surprise. We're talking about a sport where you're taking a 40-pound child and putting a 4-pound helmet on their head and asking them to run into other children. If you think about that percentage, where that helmet's 10% of their body weight, that would have been like Otis Wilson, when he played at 250 pounds, being out there with a 25-pound helmet on his head, which we would never let happen because that's crazy. The biomechanics, your brain cannot take those sorts of hits to the head. So when you strip this down, this isn't about an act to ban tackle football. This is about an act to prevent children from being hit in the head hundreds of times through sports each season. We know that we don't want to hit kids in the head in any other time of our life. We know that as adults, we don't get hit in the head hundreds of times. We actually have to pay the Chicago Bears millions of dollars to go out there and take that risk with their brain. There's no way we should be doing this for children. And it's also important to recognize that, as Mike Adamle said, we don't have treatments that can stop CTE. All right? It's going to be very hard to do that. And it hurts me to say that with Mike here today. But the reality is we can prevent CTE. Right? CTE is not a disease seen in the normal population. This is not something you get from bumping your head once in a while. This is something you can get if you take, like I did, probably 20,000 hits to your head over your career. So I urge the state of Illinois to take this opportunity seriously to prevent CTE in future football players. And it's also important to mention, as Representative Senti mentioned, that U.S. soccer banned heading before age 11 in response to concussion and CTE research. We don't have that mechanism in youth football to state a policy that will be followed by everyone. U.S. soccer can state a policy and get everyone to follow it. There is no organization in youth football that can do that. And so this has to come from the government if it's going to happen at all. This does not ban football. Remember, this will still allow children to play tackle football in middle school and in high school, and let's be honest, everyone's best memories of football are high school football. No one's getting together and having reunions with their teammates from when they were 7. All right, this is not going to change anyone's football career for the worse, but it is going to let them leave the game with the positive lessons that they've learned, and with a dramatically lower risk of developing this horrible disease, CTE, that Dave Duerson has taught us about. So I'd just like to thank everybody who's been part of this coalition to put this together. And I guess, Representative Senti, we can open the floor to questions. Thank you. Would you like to lead?
See what kind of questions we have.
12 also sounds dangerous. Why set it at 12? Not, higher.
I'm happy to answer that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm happy to answer that. So that's a good question, because last week the Concussion Legacy Foundation launched our Flag Football Under 14 campaign, because if you go to the website flagfootballu14.org, you can see a very important infographic that shows why 14 is different. But with 12, basically among all the people in the football world who believe there should be an age minimum, there's a debate between 12 and 14. And 12 is something that is pretty much universally supported among those who believe there should be a minimum age to hit a kid in the head 500 times.
Do you support 14?
So our campaign is an education campaign, so if I was advising a parent, I would say wait until 14. But for this bill, I think 12 makes a lot of sense, and we do have a lot of research that shows 12 matters. There's a magical period of brain development happening in your child between the ages of 8 and 12, and it's a terrible time to be hitting them in the head over and over again.
There's a lot of parents who say, we understand the risks, we've heard all the stories, but we want the decision to be up to us. We don't want it legislated. How do you react to that?
You want to take it?
Sure. And anyone can join me after I start. It's always a tough issue. When should government step in? For me, I think when it's a dramatic public safety issue. We've seen this whether it's maybe seat belts or children's car seats or smoking, things like that. As I was thinking about this bill and why does it feel okay for me, besides the overwhelming evidence and that we're talking about children's brains and long-term damage that can't be reversed, I think about the seatbelt law. I lost a sister before we had the seatbelt law, and it was irritating to me. And, you know, it took getting used to, and I was thinking, why do we have to do this? But she'd be here today. So I think there's times where the government does need to step in, and that's why.
Mr. Wilson, will you be donating your brain?
I thought about that, and yes, I'm gonna donate my brain. Yeah.
Could you so?
She asked, "Am I gonna donate my brain?" I don't know if they want it. I mean,
I can tell you that we want it.
okay. So yes,
You have personal.
Your mama boy.
as I will. No, in all seriousness, though, I've talked to Chris and mentioned that, and I thought about it, and I don't need it where I'm going. So might as well be able to help, you know, the process, because I mean, there are a lot of individuals that have this issue, and the more research that's being done, hopefully we can have something to combat it. To combat it, because I mean, from what I'm understanding from the athlete standpoint, it's like, well, we can't tell what's going on until you're gone. So I'm hoping that something can happen while guys are here, so that they can get that help.
What experiences have you had that give you concern for yourself, for your own health?
Well, I mean, we get together and talk all the time, playing golf or whatever we do, and that question always comes up. I mean, are you okay? Do you have whatever symptoms, whether it's, you know, arm or leg or shoulder or hip or brain? And so far, I'm okay. I mean, that's not to say that something can't happen 2 years from now. You know, so I'm just praying and hope that everything goes well.
What do you say to kids about the long-term effects or the risks of playing football for so long?
Well, I would never tell a child not to play any sport. I mean, because like Mike could tell you, you know, being in athletics has enriched my life in so many ways and our lives in so many ways, and there's so many benefits to it. But I think with this legislation, it could help, you know, younger kids, because I did a seminar with Dr. Bennett, and he was saying, we all know better, but sometimes we don't do better. You know, sometimes you throw your child in the car and don't put a seatbelt on. Or sometimes I went out there at 8 years old and played. Some guys do and don't have any problems. Some guys do have a problem. But when you talk to a child, I think if you give them the right techniques and the right, you know, coaching, it can limit some things. But something should be in place now that we see what's going on. I mean, it's not a bad idea if you start, whether it's in high school or your last year in middle school. Because I know a lot of guys that are all pros, they only play 1 year in high school. You know, so if you got the desire in you and the Lord has blessed you, you can go the distance.
Let's try your question.
How does this impact, I've heard some people who are opposed to this kind of legislation say that the kids aren't going to be prepared for the high school football. How does this impact their readiness?
Well, I don't think that's a true fact. I mean, if I'm get the right coaching, and Mike, you can attest to this, and you teach a child the proper technique, because they always tell us, if you're fundamentally sound, you can play football on any level. So understand that if you get around the right coach, or you get around the right organization, and you teach your child at that point, you know, boys, we start, I mean, when y'all, and I don't mean to sound stereotypical, when we're young, they throw a ball at us. We want to play catch. We want to play basketball. We want to play hockey. We want to do all those things. at an early age. I mean, so how do you tell a child when he's watching television and he sees his hero doing this, but not knowing what's going on behind the scenes? Now that's implanted in his brain. Then you have peer pressure. Because I had a bunch of guys that I hung out with. Everybody was playing, playing sports. So what do you think I'm gonna do? I'm gonna play sports. So if you get them in the right, if you put this thing in the right category and do the right thing with it, it won't affect you. That child will be fine.
The question is for Carol. Is there any initiative to bring this act to get more awareness nationally during Super Bowl week or anything like that?
There's a lot of interest nationally as well on this issue. I don't know anything about timing, but I think legislators both at the federal level and at the local level share a passion around this issue. So we'll have to wait and see if something comes out.
So there's no defined presence at the Super Bowl this week?
Not that I'm involved with.
Representative Senti, you talked about some hesitation and resistance from parents, but is there an organized opposition to legislation like this?
This bill just got a number this morning, and I was hesitant to let everyone know in case you're interested, House Bill 4341. So it was just filed this morning. Unlike,
I mean, have you experienced organized opposition even when you've done things in the past?
That's what I was going to say. The last bill I rolled out in a different way. I most certainly saw a lot of organized opposition against it. I think it would have been in 2013 that I first, actually it was a neurologist who's a constituent of mine. His name is Dr. Lawrence Robbins, and he brought this issue to my attention because he has a headache clinic. And so high school athletes were coming to see him and saying, I got a concussion, I have symptoms, and they're not going away. And so through this treatment and his prevalence, I became interested in this and reading about it and more aware of it. My first bill ever that I proposed was to reduce the amount of tackle football in high school. And that was, I was newer in the General Assembly. I didn't roll it out like this. There were not, I got a lot of coverage after. That bill never passed. I could never get that out of committee. So you learn things along the way. But I reached out to my local community, and at a high school, I said, come see me, come listen to our panel, talk to us, and tell us what you think, because this is what we're concerned about, because we're looking at the data and we're looking at the research. And I had doctors and players and families and parents, and it was a very two-way street. I mean, strong proponents and strong opponents. But ultimately, I did receive a lot of pushback from different organizations and from coaches and parents and families saying, we're doing a lot, and so why are you engaged in this? You're not a football player, you're not a coach. And I respect that, so I tried to move slowly and learn and listen to what people had to say. But again, the data is mounting, and so I think if we move forward carefully, we have a different approach this time. No one has come out yet on this bill, but like I said, it was just announced this morning. So we'll see how the rest of the day and the rest of the week goes, and how it's received in the General Assembly from some of my peers. Thank you.
As some of the evidence, a lot of this evidence mounts, and assuming there is like a national consensus or agreement between legislatures in the country, what kind of impact, if fewer kids are playing and more people know about CTE, does any of you imagine this will have on the sport long term? Could we see fewer people playing over time?
Go ahead, Trey.
Yeah, I'll say this. I think a part of this bill is not only to protect children's interests, but I believe this will also protect football. I grew up in Highland Park, Illinois. Our family participated in Highland Park's youth football sports program. That program doesn't exist anymore today. And the reason it doesn't exist is because children didn't show up. It didn't go away because a government official said for it to go away. And when I think about my experiences in football is not about hitting. Hitting and tackling is part of the game. What really makes football football and the lessons of it is that you have a group of people that form a plan, execute that plan, come together around a common goal to overcome obstacles and win a game. The best games in football history, no one talks about the hitting. People talk about a team going into the halftime locker room down 3 touchdowns and figure out a way, they adjust their plan, figure out a way to ultimately win the game. So I think there's a lot of benefits by limiting hitting, especially for such a young age.
A lot of youth football organizations for younger kids have started pushing flag football, particularly in that. Is that the answer, do you think? And I'd be curious to hear.
I think so. I think so. Yeah, and that's what I support. As I mentioned, hitting is part of the game, but that's not what football is and what it's about. What should be most important is understanding proper techniques, understanding how to throw, catch, run, backpedal, defend, and all of those things that make a football player. And flag football is a great answer.
So long term, how do you see professional football changing, if at all?
Well, I mean, I'll leave it up to the NFL to determine how they're going to change their game. This is not about professional football. This is about protecting the millions of people who play football at a young age. And the professional game is a game where obviously it's entertainment and there's a lot of money in it, and that changes the dynamics of what type of game they're going to present to us. But there is no place in our society where a 10-year-old should be playing like it's Super Bowl Sunday.
After this, with this act, have you all considered like pushing with like the equipment as far as like helmets? I know we're talking about concussion, but have you all thought about trying to push for maybe better helmets? I know the NFL tried to push for some, but have you all considered that at all during this time?
Well, I'll let Chris talk to the diameter of the brain, but no matter how great a helmet can be, there's only so much you can do for it.
I'll just
quickly answer the helmet aspect of it.
We're at the foundation. We're trying to help make football safer from a lot of different angles. Equipment is one of them, but the reality is, there are innovations in helmets, but the experts often say helmets are about 90% as good as they're ever going to be. So for the NFL players, college players, high school players deserve the best helmets out there, but for children, it's just not appropriate. I'll allude back to my earlier comments that we're literally putting a 4-pound helmet on 40-pound children, and there's actually no youth football standard for their helmets. I mean, there's a lot of problems that are wrong with youth tackle football, and helmets are one. So.
I just wanted to add that one of the things that the helmet, one of the technologies in newer helmets that are helping us nowadays is that they're putting sensors on them. And so different organizations are, again, for the very young players, are testing the speed and the impact. And so we have more data and we're able to follow these children and see how hard the hits are, which is where the original comment came from. Any other questions? Oops, sorry, Chris. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. And if you have any additional questions, we'll all be hanging around, anxious to support this bill. So you have a nice morning. Thanks for coming.